Hi, I now have the pleasure of leading you through a regulatory talk right after lunch. So I will do my best to keep you engaged. Not only is it a regulatory talk after lunch, I won't actually include the words allergenicity, food, or feed. So as some of my fellow regulators said, why are you here? And so I will tell you why. I'm going to explain a little bit. The points of my presentation are to give you a little background on how the U.S. government regulates genetically engineered plants, as well as what the APHIS role and what we might do with some of the data that you're all talking about in terms of compositional analysis. So back when the first organism was engineered in 1972, and soon after that, actually, there was a discussion among academicians, the public, about the role of the federal government in kind of regulating their technology and making sure it's safe for the American public. And in 1986, the document came out. It's called the Coordinated Framework for the Regulation of Biotechnology. It was through the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, where they laid out the policy of how the U.S. government was going to regulate genetic engineering. And so there's kind of three major points. One is that the safety risks of GE organisms are not fundamentally different than the safety risks posed by non-GE organisms. And you can see this main idea kind of threaded through some of the talks this morning about comparators. And so that's where the idea of comparators originated. It's kind of US policy about things that are already out there are considered the safe use piece that we compare the genetically engineered plants with. Second, the existing laws provide adequate authority. So there were no new genetically GE legislation that was developed back in the 80s when the federal role was being developed. And finally, regulation should be science-based, and it's conducted on a case-by-case basis. So recognizing the unique biology associated with each genetically engineered organism. So regulation under the Coordinated Framework for Biotechnology, it's divvied up mainly between three. These are our sister agencies, the three main players: USDA, EPA, and FDA. And so USDA was charged with looking at the safe use of genetically engineered organisms in agriculture and the environment. FDA, who's going to be the next speaker, looking at the safe use for food and feed. And EPA is looking at it at the safe use as genetically engineered organisms used as pesticides. So in this list, this is the boring regulatory talk piece of this, and so there's lots of acronyms. So USDA, as I said before, under the Coordinated Framework for Biotechnology, no new legislation was developed. We used the existing laws at the time. So USDA regulates genetically engineered organisms under the Plant Protection Act. That was actually, it's a newer act, but Plant Protection Act now. EPA uses three different acts: FIFRA, FFDCA, and TSCA, to regulate GE plants as a safe use as a pesticide, allowable levels of pesticides in food, and also uses TSCA to regulate toxic substances. And then finally, FDA uses the FFDCA to regulate the safety for food, drugs, and cosmetics. So because of how because we use existing legislation to regulate the technology, some organisms, some genetically engineered plants actually receive scrutiny from the three different agencies: EPA, FDA, and USDA. And this table goes through some examples of how that might work. And so for the first one, so for BT corn is a pesticidal use. It is a food and feed crop, and it's grown out in the environment. So it receives regulatory review by USDA, EPA, and FDA under their appropriate authorities. Something like glyphosate-tolerant soybeans also would be evaluated by the same three agencies: USDA, again, for agriculture, FDA for food safety, and EPA is actually, it's a different group in EPA that evaluates the new herbicide use on that crop. Herbicide tolerance in an ornamental crop, and I will just say I am not aware of any herbicide-tolerant tulips, but this is, I think, an example. So we would evaluate it because it's grown out in the environment, and EPA would evaluate it in terms of its herbicide use. Finally, something like high oleic soybean would be evaluated by USDA and FDA. And finally, we have modified flower color. In this case, it's blue poinsettias, but we've actually have deregulated a blue rose, and that's only evaluated by USDA. So we kind of talked about the big picture. Now, going back to where I work at USDA. It's the Ant Animal Health Inspection Service and the Biotechnology Regulatory Services. And so we are charged by our secretary to regulate genetically engineered organisms. And, okay, so some more regulatory language. Stay with me. Here we go. This is the regulatory, this is like you have to have a CFR citation in your talk. We regulate under what's called Part 340. And the regulated articles, and that's our parlance, that's the jargon that we use. So we regulate those organisms that have been altered or produced by genetic engineering, and in some fashion, if there's a possibility that that GE organism could be a plant pest. So again, go back, we regulate under the Plant Protection Act, so all of our authority is based on that act, which regulates plant pests in the environment. So in this case, for a GE organism to be considered, it has to be itself has to be a plant pest. The organism that's donating the genetic material has to be from a plant pest, or the vector or vector agent is a plant pest. And the plant pest is specifically defined by our statute in the Plant Protection Act. And it's things like pathogens, insects, bacteria, fungi, that type of thing that affect plants. So this is what we regulate. This kind of goes to what we don't regulate. We have a process where applicants can send a letter asking whether or not their organism, their genetically engineered organism, fits this definition of a regulated article. So if you go to our website, notice we call it the Am I Regulated process. There we have the mechanism and the information that we need to verify whether or not your thing is regulated by us. And we also, and another link at that page, we have a list of the inquiries that we have received using this process, as well as our responses. So you can kind of get an idea of where our boundaries are for this technology. So we just talked about what things we regulate. This is now the activities that we regulate. So if something is a regulated article, we regulate its importation into the US, we regulate its interstate movement across state lines, and we also regulate environmental release, or the field trials that people use as they are developing their product. And we do this through two different ways. It's either a permit process or a notification process. Most genetically engineered plants are under our notification process, which is a streamlined version of a permit process. And it's streamlined because a lot of the risk assessment points are actually built into our regulations. So for both permits and notifications, we review the information that's submitted. We share the information about the activity and the organism with our state and tribal partners for review and comment. And there was a question about how long it takes to change something. So this teeny weeny reg change was just finished its first public comment period, and it was started in 2006. So just to give you an idea, it takes a long time. After we've reviewed everything, we issue a permit or acknowledge a notification. And then at the back end, we also verify compliance through typically audits or inspections. Our compliance assistant piece, therefore, is a really big part of our regulatory program. Again, this is before anything is out for public consumption in most cases. Our BEQS is a quality management system for those companies that do biotechnology. It's a voluntary system, and it provides participants with the tools and the guidance that's needed to develop a quality management system that is tailored to what they do, how they do it, and what they're working on. And right now we have 19 organizations have received BEQS recognition, And there's a lot of information on our BQMS page. Again, this is a voluntary system, and it involves interactive training workshops. It has documented guidelines and templates to help the applicants or the developers meet like our requirements for submission of a notification or permit, or how it's going to help them comply with our regulations. They go through a desk audit and internal audit training. There's also targeted assistance if you need it, particularly with our academic folks that don't have quality management systems already in place or have never heard of the term quality management system. They work with them a lot. And as well as there are third-party audits that come in, so outside characters that come in and make sure they're doing what they say they're doing. So that's kind of the regulatory side of things. And so once an applicant feels comfortable, they will, if they want to, submit a petition to us, to APHIS, to USDA. And that petition is for what we call non-regulated status, or something will become deregulated. And again, it's based on our authority that the organism is not a plant pest. And our process is they submit us a packet with all the information that's dictated in our regulations. And we actually put that petition out for public comment for about 60 days. And after that, we receive the public comments, and we go through an evaluation period where we're working on a couple of our documents before we publish a final APHIS determination. And those we typically do, well, actually, there's 3 evaluations, but it's under 2 rubrics. So the first one is we do a plant pest risk assessment to determine whether or not that GE organism is likely to be a plant pest, or it would, in our jargon, it's unlikely to pose a plant pest risk. So that's what you'll see. And the other document we produce, is our environmental assessment. And this is a document that we are required to produce under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And that contains also our information related to our endangered species assessment. And if there's any point in time where we use compositional analysis or allergenicity or anything, it's typically in this document. This is the document that we evaluate things like worker safety, general issues related to public health, and we do often use the compositional data and toxicity data to evaluate the effect of the GE plant on threatened and endangered species. So it's a completely different landscape where we're using this similar types of information. So once we do all that, we get all sorts of public comment, and if we haven't been sued, then we actually are able to deregulate something. We've had 90 petitions since we had regulations in place to deregulate something, which is since 1993, since the flavor saver tomato. And they represent 16 plant species. Once the parent is deregulated, any of its progeny are also deregulated, which is why usually we don't evaluate stacks unless it's something called a molecular stack. And the actual commercialization of GE plants is really determined by market demand and not whether or not we grant non-regulated status for it. And this slide shows that. So these are the plants, the genetically engineered plants that we've granted non-regulated status to that are in large-scale production. This group over here we've also granted non-regulated status to, but they're for many, many reasons are not in large-scale production in the U.S. And that's it. Hopefully I've gotten us a little bit back on time. And so here's where you can find more information about Biotech BRS. And if there's time, I can take any questions.